Welcome to our deep dive today.
Yes.
We're going to be exploring the very first Star Wars expanded universe novel,
Right.
Splinter of the Mind's Eye,
It's a classic.
published in 1978, written by Ellen Dean Foster.
Yes.
Now, before we even crack this thing open,
Yeah.
there's already something kind of fascinating about this book.
It predates the release of the film,
Oh, really?
Star Wars, A New Hope,
Great.
which makes it quite the unique piece of Star Wars history.
Almost feels like we're about to uncover like a lost scroll or something.
Right.
We've got some great sources lined up to kind of help us navigate this deep dive.
Okay.
We'll be drawing insights from Chris Taylor's How Star Wars Conquered the Universe for context about the expanded universe.
Yes.
And, of course, Wikipedia for all those essential Star Wars facts.
Of course.
And, well, let's just say Junta Jewel's review in their blog, Culture Shock, adds a certain spice to the mix.
I think spice is putting it mildly.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay, we'll get into that.
Yeah, we'll get into that later.
Definitely.
Yeah. So as we embark on this journey into the very first Star Wars expanded universe novel,
Yeah.
our mission is to kind of figure out where it all began.
Hmm.
What early ideas about the Star Wars universe can we find in this book?
Wow.
How does it fit into the larger saga?
Yes.
And perhaps most importantly, is it as strange and wonderful as everyone says?
All excellent questions.
Yeah.
But let's start with the very foundation of this deep dive.
Okay.
The fact that Splinter of the Mind's Eye wasn't just meant to be a novel.
Oh, really?
It was originally conceived as a potential low-budget sequel
Okay.
to Star Wars,
Right.
A New Hope, in case the movie didn't do well at the box office.
Wait, so there's a world out there where this book could have been our only glimpse into
Yeah.
what happened after A New Hope?
It's wild.
That's wild.
Yeah, picture this,
Okay.
a Star Wars universe where the story continues,
Okay.
but with a distinctly different vibe.
Okay.
Lucas envisioned a sort of Sergio Leone Western in space feel for this potential sequel. Gritty, limited in scope, and probably filmed on a shoestring budget.
That explains why this whole adventure takes place on a foggy, swampy planet called Mimben.
Yeah.
Definitely not the most glamorous setting in the galaxy.
Precisely.
No.
And another fun fact,
Okay.
the novel was actually written and published before A New Hope even premiered in theaters.
Wow, that's incredible.
I know.
Alan Dean Foster was essentially writing blind
Totally.
without even knowing if the movie would be a hit or not.
He was working off of early drafts of the script,
Oh, wow.
some rough footage, and a few pieces of concept art.
Wow.
Talk about a leap of faith.
And to make things even more challenging, he had to work with a very limited cast of characters.
Yeah.
No Han Solo, no
Yeah.
Chewbacca,
Yep.
just Luke and Leia facing the dangers of Mimban together.
Harrison Ford's contract situation at the time prevented Han Solo from being included.
Oh, I see.
So Foster had to find creative ways to make the story work with just Luke and Leia.
I see.
And that, my friend, is where things start to get interesting.
Interesting indeed.
Yeah.
You mentioned spice earlier,
Yeah.
and I have a feeling this is where that comes into play.
Right?
The excerpts we have from Jules' review suggest that Foster's interpretation of Luke and Leia's relationship
Yes.
might raise a few eyebrows, shall we say.
Let's just say it's a far cry from the brother-sister dynamic we all know and love from the later films.
So in a way, this novel offers us a glimpse into like a parallel Star Wars universe.
Exactly.
One where the story took a very different path.
And to fully appreciate that alternate path,
Yeah.
we need to understand the driving force behind the plot of Splinter of the Mind's Eye.
Okay.
It all revolves around a mysterious artifact called the Kyber crystal.
Okay. That name rings a bell.
Yeah.
Is this something that connects to the larger Star Wars universe?
It absolutely does.
Okay.
But in a fascinating and unexpected way.
Okay.
In the novel, the Kyber crystal is described as this powerful object
Okay.
that can enhance a Force user's abilities.
So like if you're a Jedi, it's basically a super-powered battery pack
That's a great way to put it.
for your Force powers.
Now, what's truly intriguing is that this concept of a Force-enhancing crystal didn't just disappear.
Oh, really?
It went through a fascinating evolution over time.
Hold on. Are you saying that the Kyber crystal is connected to something we see in the later Star Wars films or shows?
Let's just say there's a good chance you've already encountered the modern-day equivalent of the Kyber crystal,
Oh, wow.
but in a completely different form.
This is already blowing my mind.
I know, right?
I can't wait to see how this all connects.
Right.
But before we get ahead of ourselves,
Right.
let's rewind back to Mimban
Oh,
and figure out what this Kyber crystal actually does in the story.
well, it basically kicks off a wild goose chase
Mm-hmm.
through the swamps of Mimban.
Okay.
Luke and Leia, guided by a mysterious old woman named Hala, find themselves on a quest to find this crystal,
Okay.
facing all sorts of dangers along the way.
This sounds like the classic Star Wars recipe for adventure. Crash landing on a strange planet, a mysterious artifact,
Yes.
a quest that could determine the fate of the galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing this book, I have a feeling there are going to be some unexpected twists and turns along the way.
You can say that again.
Yeah.
And I think it's about time we dive into one of the most talked about aspects of Splinter of the Mind's Eye,
Okay.
the relationship between Luke and Leia.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Let's unpack this carefully.
Okay.
From what I've gathered, their dynamic in this novel is a far cry from what we see in the later films.
Totally.
Jewel even uses the phrase extraordinarily awkward in their review.
Yeah, it's definitely a product of its time.
Yeah.
Remember, Splinter of the Mind's Eye was written before the big reveal of their sibling connection in Return of the Jedi.
Oh, right.
So Foster had no way of knowing that their relationship would become well complicated later on.
So he was free to explore a potential romantic connection between them.
Right.
But knowing what we know now,
Yeah.
it definitely adds a layer of
To
discomfort.
put it mildly. We'll definitely be diving into some of the more, shall we say,
Okay.
memorable passages from the novel to
Yeah.
give you a sense of just how awkward things get.
All right, I'm bracing myself.
Yeah.
But before we delve into the complexities of Luke and Leia's relationship,
Okay.
I think it's time we turn our attention to the big bad himself,
Yes.
Darth Vader.
Ah, yes. The Dark Lord of the Sith makes a rather interesting appearance in Splinter of the Mind's Eye.
Okay.
It's actually one of my favorite aspects of the book.
Hey, now I'm really intrigued.
Yeah.
How is Vader portrayed in this early version of the Star Wars universe?
Well, you have to remember that this was before The Empire Strikes Back,
Right.
before we got to see the depth and complexity of his character.
Yeah.
In Splinter of the Mind's Eye, Vader is still very much a proto-villain.
Okay.
He's driven by power and a desire to crush the rebellion,
Okay.
but he's not quite the imposing figure we later come to know.
So he's more of a straightforward bad guy at this point?
Exactly.
Less tragic figure, more mustache-twirling villain?
But what makes it even more interesting
Okay.
is that there are moments where he's almost goofy.
Wait, goofy?
Goofy.
As in Darth Vader cracking jokes?
Yeah.
That's not an image I can easily conjure up.
Oh, trust me, it's in there.
Okay.
There's a scene where he's dueling with Leia,
Mm-hmm.
and he practically encourages her to amuse him.
Wow.
It's so unexpected and honestly kind of hilarious in hindsight.
Wow. This is really painting a picture of a very different Darth Vader than the one we're used to.
It's like looking at an early draft of a masterpiece.
Yeah.
You can see the potential, the raw power.
Right.
But it's not quite the polished, iconic figure we all know and love.
This is incredible. I'm already starting to see how Splinter of the Mind's Eye gives us this fascinating glimpse into the early days of the Star Wars universe,
Oh, it is.
where everything was still taking shape.
It was still being formed.
It's almost like we're peering behind the curtain and
Yeah.
seeing the evolution of these iconic characters and concepts in real time.
That's precisely what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
Huh.
Yeah. But there's so much more to uncover.
Okay.
The impact of Splinter of the Mind's Eye extends far beyond its quirky characters and unexpected plot twists.
Okay.
We need to talk about its legacy.
All right.
Its place as the very first installment of the sprawling Star Wars expanded universe.
Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity.
Yep.
What makes this seemingly strange little novel so significant in the grand scheme of Star Wars storytelling?
That's a great question, and one we'll be tackling head-on in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll explore how Splinter of the Mind's Eye helped shape the vast and complex world of the Star Wars expanded universe,
Okay.
and how its influence can still be felt today, even in the era of Disney canon.
This is shaping up to be one of the most fascinating deep dives yet.
It is.
I can't wait to see what other surprises this novel has in store for us.
I have a feeling you won't be disappointed.
Okay.
Yeah. Welcome back to our deep dive into Splinter of the Mind's Eye.
Yes.
We've already uncovered some fascinating tidbits about this early entry in the Star Wars universe.
Right.
But now it's time to explore its legacy.
You mentioned that this book is considered the very first installment of the Star Wars expanded universe.
Right.
What does that even mean for those of us who might not be familiar with the term?
Great question. The expanded universe, often abbreviated as EU, is basically a vast collection of Star Wars stories,
Okay.
told outside of the main saga films. Think novels, comic books, video games, you name it.
Okay.
And it all started with Splinter of the Mind's Eye.
So this book with its swamp monsters, awkward romance, and goofy Darth Vader is
Yeah.
the seed from which this whole sprawling universe grew.
Exactly. It's like the Big Bang of Star Wars storytelling.
Wow.
Before Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the only Star Wars story we had was the original film.
Right.
But this novel opened up a whole new galaxy of possibilities.
Wow.
It showed that there were stories to be told beyond the adventures of Luke, Leia, and Han.
And speaking of adventures, I think it's time we delve into some of the specifics of Splinter of the Mind's Eye. You mentioned earlier that Luke and Leia's relationship is unique.
That's one way to put it. Remember, this book was written before The Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah.
And long before the big reveal in Return of the Jedi.
Right.
So the idea of a romantic connection between Luke and Leia was still very much on the table.
But knowing what we know now, it definitely makes for some uncomfortable reading.
Yeah.
Jules' review mentions Leia being referred to as a steel kitten and Luke's servant girl.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't exactly sound like the Leia we know and love.
No, it doesn't. And those are just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, boy.
There are moments in the book where the romantic tension between them is almost palpable.
Really?
There's a scene where Leia is practically pressed up against Luke, feeling his body heat.
Oh, wow.
And another where Luke is admiring Leia's moistly parted lips as she sleeps.
Okay, that's officially crossing a line even without the whole sibling thing.
Yeah.
I can see why Jewel called it extraordinarily awkward.
Awkward is putting it mildly. But it's important to remember the context. At the time, this was simply a way to explore the dynamic between these two characters.
Right.
No one knew that their relationship would take such a dramatic turn in the later films.
It's like a strange alternate reality version of Star Wars where Luke and Leia's story went down a very different path.
Exactly.
But even with all this awkwardness, there are still elements of this book that connect to the larger Star Wars universe, right? Like the Kyber crystal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the way that concept evolved is fascinating. In Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the Kyber crystal is this glowing rock
Okay.
that enhances force powers.
So it's kind of like a force multiplier,
Yeah.
giving the user an edge in battle or other force-related activities.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that this idea of a force-enhancing crystal didn't just vanish.
Right.
It actually transformed into something we see in the later films and shows. Kyber crystals.
Wait, are you telling me that the Kyber crystal is somehow related to the Kyber crystals that power lightsabers?
It's not a direct one-to-one connection,
Right.
but thematically and conceptually, they share some striking similarities.
Okay.
Both are crystals that have a deep connection to the Force,
Right.
and both can be used to amplify a Force user's abilities.
So the Kyber crystal was sort of a prototype,
Yeah,
an early exploration of an idea that would later become a cornerstone of the Star Wars universe.
right.
That's incredible. It's amazing to see how this seemingly obscure novel planted the seeds for something that would become so essential to the Star Wars mythology.
It really highlights how interconnected the Star Wars universe is, even across different continuities and timelines.
Right.
And it speaks to the creative ingenuity of the early EU authors,
Mm-hmm.
who were essentially building this vast world from scratch.
But it wasn't just about expanding the universe. Splinter of the Mind's Eye also introduced some intriguing ideas about the nature of the Force itself.
Exactly. When the novel, the Force is portrayed as this mystical energy field that permeates all living things.
Okay.
It's described as being connected to the planet itself, specifically the planet's living ecosystem.
That's different from how the Force is typically depicted in the films, where it's more about individual power and ability.
It is. In Splinter of the Mind's Eye, there's this emphasis on the interconnectedness of all living things through the Force.
Right.
It's almost like a precursor to the concept of the living Force that we see later in Star Wars lore.
So this novel not only introduced the concept of force-enhancing crystals, but also hinted at a deeper understanding of the Force itself.
Precisely. It's like Foster was laying the groundwork for some of the more complex and nuanced ideas about the Force that would be explored in later works.
Yeah, okay.
But before we get too deep into the philosophical implications of the Force,
Right.
I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. Darth Vader.
Oh, yes. How could we forget about the big bad himself? You mentioned earlier that he's portrayed in a rather unexpected way in this book.
Let's just say that the Darth Vader we meet in Splinter of the Mind's Eye
Okay.
is a far cry from the imposing, menacing figure we see in the films.
Right.
He's still a powerful Sith Lord, but he's also, well, a little goofy.
Goofy Darth Vader. I'm still having trouble wrapping my head around that concept. Can you give me some specific examples?
Of course.
Yeah.
Remember that scene I mentioned where he's dueling with Leia?
Yes.
He actually encourages her to amuse him.
What?
It's almost like he's treating the whole fight as a game.
That's so bizarre. It's like he's completely forgotten that he's supposed to be this terrifying embodiment of evil.
Right. And there are other moments where he makes these sort of off-colored jokes and suggestive comments that are just weird.
Oh, really?
It's definitely not the Darth Vader we're used to.
So how do we explain this strange portrayal? Was
Yeah.
Foster just trying to add some levity to the story?
Mhm.
Or was this simply how Darth Vader was conceived at that early stage of the Star Wars universe?
It's probably a bit of both. Remember, this is before The Empire Strikes Back fleshed out Vader's character
Right.
and gave him that tragic backstory.
Yeah.
So Foster had more freedom to experiment with his personality.
I see.
And it's possible that he was also influenced by Lucas's vision for a space western feel,
Right.
which might have led to a more lighthearted and quirky take on the character.
It's fascinating to see how even a character as iconic as Darth Vader went through such a dramatic evolution. It makes you realize that nothing in the Star Wars universe is truly set in stone.
Exactly. And that's what makes exploring the expanded universe so rewarding.
Yeah.
It's full of these unexpected twists and turns these glimpses into alternate possibilities and what-if scenarios.
Right.
It allows us to see familiar characters and concepts from a completely new perspective.
But with so many stories being told across different mediums, did Lucasfilm have any sort of control over the expanded universe, or was it just a free-for-all?
It was a delicate balancing act.
Okay.
Lucasfilm wanted to encourage creativity and allow authors to explore different corners of the galaxy,
Right.
but they also needed to make sure the expanded universe didn't contradict the main saga films.
I can imagine that would be a challenge. How do you manage a sprawling fictional universe while still maintaining some semblance of consistency?
They established a system where authors had to submit their outlines and manuscripts for approval,
Okay.
and they couldn't kill off major characters or drastically alter established lore.
I see.
It was like a sandbox, but with some pretty strict rules.
So there was a sense of collaboration and oversight to ensure that the expanded universe stayed true to the spirit of Star Wars,
Right.
while also allowing for creative freedom.
Exactly. And for the most part, it worked quite well.
Yeah.
The expanded universe flourished, introducing countless new characters, planets, and storylines.
Wow.
It enriched the Star Wars galaxy in ways that no one could imagine back in 1978,
Right.
when Splinter of the Mind's Eye was first published.
But of course, not everyone was happy with every decision.
Right.
There were bound to be fans who felt that certain stories strayed too far from the source material.
That's inevitable with a franchise as massive and beloved as Star Wars. But I think it's important to remember that the expanded universe was never meant to be a monolithic entity.
Yeah.
It was about exploring different possibilities, telling
Okay.
different kinds of stories,
Right.
and giving fans a chance to experience the Star Wars galaxy from new perspectives.
And in that regard, I think it succeeded brilliantly.
Absolutely.
But then, as you mentioned earlier, everything changed with the Disney acquisition in 2012.
Ah, yes, the Great Reset. It was a seismic shift in the Star Wars landscape.
Yeah.
The expanded universe, which had been growing and evolving for over 3 decades,
Wow.
was suddenly rebranded as Legends,
Right.
and a new unified canon was established.
I remember when that happened. It sparked a lot of debate among fans.
Yeah.
Some were thrilled about the prospect of a fresh start, while others were heartbroken to see their beloved stories relegated to non-canonical status.
It was a bittersweet moment for many.
Great.
But from a storytelling perspective,
Yeah.
I can understand why Disney made that decision.
They wanted to streamline the narrative, create a more cohesive and consistent universe that wouldn't be weighed down by the complexities and contradictions of the expanded universe.
Exactly. They needed a clean slate to tell their own stories,
Yeah.
unconstrained by the vast and sometimes unwieldy legacy of the EU.
Right.
But even though the expanded universe is no longer considered canon,
Right.
its impact on the Star Wars galaxy is undeniable.
It laid the foundation for a whole new era of storytelling, and many of its ideas, characters, and concept continue to inspire and influence the Star Wars stories being told today.
It's a testament to the enduring power of the expanded universe that even in its non-canonical form,
Yeah.
it continues to resonate with fans and shape the Star Wars galaxy.
And it all started with Splinter of the Mind's Eye,
Yes.
a quirky, awkward, and surprisingly influential little novel that dared to imagine what lay beyond the boundaries of the original
I
film.
love that.
What an incredible journey. We've gone from the swamps of Mimban to the vast expanse of the expanded universe,
That's been a wild ride.
and explored the evolution of iconic characters and concepts. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious to hear your personal thoughts on Splinter of the Mind's Eye.
Yeah.
What was your overall impression of the book?
It was definitely a wild ride.
Okay.
There were moments that made me laugh,
Uh-huh.
moments that made me cringe,
Mm-hmm.
and moments that genuinely surprised me. It's a product of its time, no doubt,
Yeah.
but there's also a certain charm to its rough edges.
Right.
It feels like a raw, unfiltered expression of early Star Wars fandom.
It's like a time capsule capturing the excitement and imagination of those early days
I love that.
when the Star Wars universe was just beginning to expand.
Totally.
But we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we move on to the final thoughts?
Just this. Despite its quirks and flaws, Splinter of the Mind's Eye holds a special place in Star Wars history.
Yeah.
It was the spark that ignited a galaxy of stories, a testament to the boundless possibilities of imagination
Right.
and the enduring power of fandom.
Beautifully said. Now let's shift our focus to the big picture.
Okay.
What is this deep dive into Splinter of the Mind's Eye? Tell us about the nature of storytelling fandom
Yeah.
and the ever-evolving world of Star Wars.
That's a question that deserves its own deep dive.
Yes, it does.
But I think we can offer some initial reflections.
Okay.
What stands out to you?
Yeah, what stands out to me is just how much potential there was in those early days.
Right.
It's like a galaxy of untapped stories just waiting to be told.
And it really speaks to the power of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Because back then, there were no limits. There were no hard and fast rules about what Star Wars could or couldn't be.
Right. It was all about exploring those uncharted territories.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we can still learn from today,
Yeah, even with the new canon.
even with the new canon.
So,
Because while it's important to have some structure and consistency,
right.
it's equally important to remember that Star Wars is at its heart a universe of endless possibilities.
Yeah, it's not just about adhering to a rigid set of rules.
Right.
It's about embracing that spirit of adventure and creativity.
Absolutely. And I think Splinter the Mind's Eye, for all its quirks and flaws,
Yeah.
really embodies that spirit. It's a reminder that Star Wars can be weird and wonderful and unexpected.
It definitely challenges our preconceived notions of what a Star Wars story should be.
Yeah, and that's a good thing.
It is, because it reminds us that there's always more to discover.
Always more stories to tell.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me.
For me too.
It's made me appreciate the expanded universe in a whole new light.
And it's shown us how much the Star Wars galaxy has evolved over the years.
And how it continues to evolve.
That's the beauty of it. It's a living, breathing universe that's constantly expanding and changing.
But no matter how much it changes, I think there's a core essence of Star Wars that always remains the same.
What do you think that essence is?
I think it's that sense of wonder, that feeling of being transported to a galaxy far, far away,
Right.
where anything is possible.
That's beautifully said. And I think Splinter of the Mind's Eye, in its own unique way, captures that sense of wonder.
Yeah, it reminds us that Star Wars is ultimately about hope,
Mm-hmm.
about the struggle between good and evil,
Right.
and the belief that even in the darkest of times, there's always a light that shines through.
That's the heart of Star Wars.
So even though Splinter of the Mind's Eye might be a bit rough around the edges,
Yeah.
it's still a valuable part of the Star Wars legacy.
And it's a story that I think deserves to be rediscovered and appreciated by a new generation of fans.
I couldn't agree more. Well, this has been an absolutely incredible deep dive.
It has.
Thank you so much for joining me on this journey.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in.
Yes.
We hope you've enjoyed this exploration of Splinter of the Mind's Eye.
And that it's inspired you to seek out and explore other corners of the Star Wars universe.
Because there's a whole galaxy of stories out there just waiting to be discovered.
May the Force be with you always.
Always.